strategy for some other things that the president's doing. So I'm yawning about tariffs. I just think it's a big nothing burger. What interests me more in terms of government policy is deregulation. Where is that going to go? What industries are going to be impacted? It's kind of interesting on the debt market. Private debt capital today comprises almost 90% of commercial loan transactions. Now think about that for a second. Everybody thinks it's, the regulated institutions, those institutions that hold deposits, that are, the ones that are really making the loans today. And they had 90% of the market probably 10 to 15 years ago. And that has shrunk over time because of the cost of regulation in terms of the banking industry, which private debt capital doesn't have. So I think there's two things to pay attention to there. Either the government is going to start to regulate private debt capital, which I don't see any purpose in doing that because they're not protecting the consumer on the deposit side. Or banks today will exist predominantly to make consumer loans and hold deposits. And I don't believe that's a sustainable position.
Hello there, M&A Advisor community. This is Roger Aguinaldo, and welcome back to the M&A Advisor podcast. Since 1998, the M&A Advisor's mission is to recognize achievements, provide thought leadership, and connect professionals in mergers and acquisitions for the purpose of improving your deal-making craft and accelerating your deal flow. We are so glad you're joining us for this insightful and inspiring podcast conversation curated for mergers and acquisitions professionals. Whether you're an aspiring deal maker, a seasoned professional, or just curious about the world of mergers and acquisitions, you'll find something valuable and relevant in our podcast. Our goal is to bring you the best insights, stories, and tips from the experts who've been there and done that, so you can learn from their successes and mistakes and take your deal-making skills to the next level. But before we dive into today's episode, we have a small favor to ask you. If you enjoy listening to our podcast and find it useful, please consider following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and subscribing to our M&A Alerts newsletter. You can find the links in the description below. This will help us reach more people like you and grow our community of M&A professionals. It will also let us know that you appreciate our work and want us to keep producing more quality content for you. Plus, you'll never miss an episode, and you'll always be in the loop with the latest trends in the M&A world to improve and accelerate your deal making. So please follow us. You are the reason we do what we do, and we couldn't do it without you. And now for today's podcast.
All right, so our next session is on private equity, boom or bust, navigating private equity in the new political era. This conversation is going to be with Patrick O'Keefe. Patrick is founder and CEO at O'Keefe, and he will be in conversation with Lorie Beers. Lorie is the managing director and head of special situations at Intrepid Investment Bankers. Please give them a welcome.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. We're going to skip introductions because we were just introduced and we only have 20 minutes, so we're going to just get right to it. I will say that this was not the topic that we were prepared to speak on. We were supposed to talk about the impact of the political era on M&A transactions, but we're just going to roll with it. So that's where we are. So just to start, by show of hands, take yourself back to December, January of this year, and how many people thought that this administration was going to be positive for M&A activity? It's a pretty good number. And as we sit here today, how many people think that this administration is going to be positive for M&A activity? Okay, different people, about the same response. I guess, Pat, let's just start with, first of all, how do you feel about that? Do you think we're in a good or a bad climate for M&A or the impact on private equity?
Well, we're clearly in the sea of uncertainty, and uncertainty depresses multiples and deal pricing. And so, you have seller expectations when you're coming off a boom in 22 and 23 where people saw real high multiples that are now, the buyers are a little slower to transact, a little more cautious because they don't understand the impact of tariffs and the world economic situation. I think tariffs, I thought Wilbur Ross, who I could listen to all day, put it pretty succinctly. I don't think people understand that it's just a tool. And I would reserve judgment on the direction of the economy until probably July. Let some things sort out. There are a number of sectors that are not being hurt right now. And when you look at tariffs, I mean, the impact of tariffs, and I think MIT Sloan put out a study that it's really only going to impact GDP at most 11 to 12%. And there's a lot of sectors that are not impacted by some of the current policies that are being considered. You look at healthcare, technology, in areas like that, you just haven't seen, they're just not going to, impact those types of things. I think Mr. Ross again pointed out consumers have been impacted by a lot of free money that maybe has pulled forward demand in consumer discretionary products. I would be very hesitant today to be jumping into a consumer product company on the M&A side, just because I think there's a risk that the economy may slow down. When you look at consumer debt today and consumer defaults, it's high. It's higher than it's ever been. People will argue the other side of that, saying that asset values that support that debt have also never been higher. So as a percentage, it really isn't that bad. But there's no question that there has been a stimulus which will be very inflationary. It has been inflationary with the free government money into the market.
What industries do you think have been impacted by current policies?
Well, again, I'll go back to consumer discretionary. People worry about manufacturing. And I'm from the Midwest. Our practice is in Detroit. And I can tell you, among many automotive suppliers, tariffs are a big yawn. They've come through tariffs before. That's nothing new. They've dealt with labor issues. They've dealt with commodity pricing. And they always figure it out. And I think the U.S. economy is a lot more resilient than people give it credit for. But consumer products would scare me today. I'd be worried about that.
I think that, there's a lot of fuss being made about tariffs, but there are other policies that are either been enacted or being considered by this administration that impact M&A activity and investment. For example, food and ag. You've got a situation where you've got not only tariffs, which are impacting those types of companies, but also immigration policies. What do you think about that?
All right. So we actually spend a lot of time, and I've been CRO of some ag companies. And, until you really get involved and get into the details of these, you just don't have an appreciation. So we did a fairly prolific turnaround of Graceland fruit up in northern Michigan. It was a co-op of 28 cherry farmers who were trying to find other products that they could sell instead of cherries in a quart box on a highway stand. And what was interesting is they came up with this concept of nutraceuticals, and that they were going to deliver, nutraceuticals and healthy fruits. Of course, if you've ever had dried fruit, it's comprised of about 90% sugar. It's anything but healthy. So don't be eating those, salads with cherries, dried cherries all over them. They had about 50 pounds. But what was interesting about it, they doubled the market with this program in the U.S. for cherry consumption, selling it off as a healthy fruit. What the U.S. did, an ally, Turkey, that is a big ag, especially cherries, is a big commodity for Turkey. And so they opened up this new market into the U.S., allowed Turkey to dump cherries into the marketplace. And I believe, it was for defense reasons. I mean, we wanted to have airfields there and a good ally with Turkey, and that was one of our ways to conduct trade with them. And that was done on the back of the farmers. And the farmers had nothing to say about it. And so, you talk about governmental subsidies in certain industries, I would make a strong argument that for ag, the government needs to supply subsidies to that industry if, in fact, that's going to be their position in terms of international trade for reasons that the farmer doesn't see. So I think, our ag policies matter a lot because there's not a lot of money in ag. A lot of family farms. I think in Michigan, for instance, we have 10,000 farms, and that's dwindling because the third and fourth generation that has taken over these farms is seeing how hard their parents work, and they don't see any money in it. There's a lot of easier ways to make money. So our trade policies in ag will matter. But I don't believe necessarily that that's, a big PE play because it's been a declining industry.
Let's talk about PE in particular. You mentioned in your early comments about the volatility in the market and the fact that tariffs have created an unsettling market dynamic. How do you, if you're in a PE firm, get an investment through committee without knowing where the economy's going, given the trade policies?
So again, I'm taking a wait and see proposition because I think there's a lot of sectors that are not impacted by tariffs. And again, it's a small percentage of GDP, but I think the level of uncertainty, he doesn't like uncertainty, and they're not going to pay for it for sure. And so I think tariffs are going to be a nothing burger. I kind of share Wilbur Ross's position, and I know the Wall Street Journal didn't like to hear it being blamed on the media. The Wall Street Journal has been negative on tariffs. It seems like every day they've got a negative story on how tariffs are so bad. And if you talk to economists, they all say the same thing, that tariffs are bad, they're inflationary, they're not good for the economy. A lot of tariffs before the Great Depression. But I think this time it's being used more as a tool, and I believe it's temporary. I do not believe that this is going to be a permanent game, and I believe it's a strategy for some other things that the president's doing. So I'm yawning about tariffs. I just think it's a big nothing burger. What interests me more in terms of government policy is deregulation. Where is that going to go? What industries are going to be impacted? It's kind of interesting on the debt market. Private debt capital today comprises almost 90% of commercial loan transactions. Now think about that for a second. Everybody thinks it's, the regulated institutions, those institutions that hold deposits that are, the ones that are really making the loans today. And they had 90% of the market probably 10 to 15 years ago. And that has shrunk over time because of the cost of regulation in terms of the banking industry, which private debt capital doesn't have. So I think there's two things to pay attention to there. Either the government is going to start to regulate private debt capital, which I don't see any purpose in doing that because they're not protecting the consumer on the deposit side, or banks today will exist predominantly to make consumer loans and hold deposits. And I don't believe that's a sustainable position. So I think we were in Chicago a couple weeks ago, one of my directors and I, and we were talking to a private debt capital source. And I said, where do you get your money? And the funny part of it is their funding is from 25 to 30 federally regulated banks. Now think about that for a second. Their cost of funds is generally 300 to 400 basis points higher than a regulated institution. But because of the regulations, the banks can't make the same deals that the private debt capital can. And so what do? They got to earn interest income because they've got a cost of the deposits. They throw behind consortium of people who can get it out on an unregulated basis. And so capital finds its path of least resistance. And I think that is not a sustainable model for the banking industry. I just don't believe it.
So how does that get solved?
Man, that's a good question. I think there's going to be a lot of consolidation in banks. I think we're probably overbanked. I paid notice to Jamie Dimon. Jamie Dimon comes out a couple weeks ago and says, we're going to protect our 35,000 middle market customers. We're going to, throw $1 billion, at this market to protect our turf and in the capital that we have in it. Okay, Jamie Dimon can say that. But, can Huntington Bank Regions Bank, Key Bank, Fifth Third Bank, I'll say the same thing. Probably not. And if they look at their loan growth, it's coming from existing customers. They're not really able to compete with private debt capital. So either we have to decide that we need banks, which there is a consumer aspect to it that private debt capital does not cater to, and we have to change that. But whether or not they come in, I mean, private debt capital has a lot of advantages that the regulators will never allow banks to do. The ability to work out on a deal, no personal guarantees, to really have a partner, which is what banks used to be 20 years ago.
So do you think that bodes for the expansion of private capital? Do you think we're going to see more private capital than we have now?
I do. I do, because the yields are just better. I mean, look at the advent of family funds over the last 5 to 7 years. I mean, who ever heard of a family fund 7, 8 years ago? Now they're all over the place. And I think the ability to earn attractive yields in that space is so much better than being involved in any type of institutional investment.
So let's pivot for a minute and talk about how the impacts of these policies are going to impact the distress and restructuring worlds. Do you think that we are going to see an uptick in restructuring activity as a result of government policies?
I do, but not for the existing government policies. I think we did a great disservice with all the free money that we put into the market through the COVID years, in that companies with bad business plans were able to survive with free money. And so in terms of restructuring, what I see now is you've got to have a legitimate business if you're going to survive, because there's no government bailout and no money that's going to be available to you to hide a problem. And so I think I'm bullish on restructuring going forward. I think companies are going to be ill-equipped to deal with uncertainty. There's not going to be as much liquidity in the marketplace for them, as there's plenty of liquidity out there. It's just not going to be for people with bad business plans. And I think that is going to become more and more apparent as we get into this economic cycle of uncertainty.
And where does that, what form does that take? Are these true restructurings? Are they, distressed M&A? Are they liquidations? Where do you think that's going? If there's a path.
Yeah, again, I think that's a good question. PE has done a good job of being an aggregator, consolidating businesses. So I think there's going to be plenty of opportunity in the PE area. And if owners are smart enough, they'll be able to squeeze some juice out of the lemon or go out of business, kind of thing. So I think, there'll be a window for companies to transact. And if they don't, then they're probably, being sold in a 363 or liquidate. There are some advantages. I mean, some companies, and I forget which panel talked about this, but you've got a lot more options at the beginning, and your ability to attract capital where you need to expand. I mean, onshoring is real. People are going to figure out ways to service some of these big, I'll pick on the automotive industry. I mean, there's probably been 3 or 4 foreign companies that says we're going to build plants. Well, plants require the supply base to be close to them. So if you're not doing business with them now, you're going to be doing business. And if you are, you're going to have to expand that existing business and capabilities to do it. That's going to require capital. And I think you're going to see an expansion. So if you have underutilized capacity, normally that would be a bad thing. I think strategically, some people will find that to be very advantageous in terms of being able to service the onshoring options that they have.
I know you said you think tariffs are a big yawn, but in light of what you just said about expansions, a lot of U.S. manufacturing has put facilities in Mexico because it's easier to attract labor. There's a lot of reasons for them to have facilities in Mexico. Given where the current administration is on tariffs to Mexico, do you think those factories repatriate to the U.S.? Do you think that stays where it is?
So I think it's a different labor that's needed that is not coming from Mexico. And I think this is where education matters and where the U.S. has failed. I think it should be concerning to everybody in this room that we're like 40th in the world in terms of education, yet we spend more than anybody in trying to educate the next generation of workers. These jobs are very skilled. And we've got a defense contractor that we're on a sell side engagement on right now, who I said, where do you get the workers? They do specialty welding and specialty processes. And the owner was very proud. He says, I have 5 father and son combinations working. And he points to every machine on the plant floor through his big window. And he says, you see that old guy with the beard over there? That kid standing next to him is his son. And he's teaching him how to operate that machine. And so the relationships with the community colleges, I think, is going to be more important, because you're going to have to train people to do skilled labor. And I think we're positioned to do that if we embrace it. And I don't believe those workers are coming from Mexico. I just don't for a minute. And that's the workforce that we're going to need.
So how can we put all those plants there?
I think some of those are coming back. I'm not convinced that Mexico, I think you've got a lot of dynamics there. It's not an easy discussion. You and I, when we were talking about this is more of a 2-hour discussion than it is a 20-minute discussion. But you've got China pushing through a lot of parts through Mexico because of the, I'll get it wrong, the MCA, the Mexican Canadian American Trade policy. And that's going to be undone because people are taking advantage of that, and it's not for its real intended purpose. And I don't know if anybody here plays in the automotive manufacturing space, but one of the great emperor's new clothes is minority suppliers. Minority suppliers, for the most part, are aggregators. They pull in parts from a lot of different places, they package them, and then the OEMs get credit that they bought from a minority supplier. And it's a facade. Nothing really happens. And I think, the Trump team is looking at how China and other countries are using Mexico to obfuscate some of the pure trade policies that are needed to really grow our economy. And they're going to look at it and redo it. So I think Mexico's going to be a different game going forward. And I don't think they're going to be as industrial as they've once enjoyed, because I think there's going to be a greater incentive to move the production into the U.S. versus having all these countries, do it in Mexico and pass it through under the Favorable Trade Act.
Okay, we're very short conversation. We're at a minute. We'll open it up now for questions if folks have any questions.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. So I do underline basically, Patrick, what you said, very much depicted well. I believe there is a great opportunity in this whole discussion about tariffs currently, because even if there's a stalemate on M&A right now, people don't know what to do. That is an opportunity to not go further south, basically, and reconsider your manufacturing base here in the U.S. And what we do going through these companies, we often see it is possible to raise the productivity. The problem often lies in the overhead structure, which have been built up over years and years, so to say. So overall productivity can be increased. American manufacturing can be actually brought to a higher level. And it will require, as you said, basically skilled labor. What I wonder in this context here, to avoid that companies come to a point, are looked upon, etc., and then maybe deciding, well, we can't rescue anymore, we go into Chapter 11, etc., or get sold off. Is there anything the private equity community is doing to pinpoint targets early and say, these have potentials, let's get them verified, and then let's get them ready for an attractive transaction, so to say?
Yeah, I mean, private equity, I don't believe private equity provides any value. So I'll start there, and I'm sure piss off some people in this room. But they're predominantly aggregators. But what they are good at is making sure that capital is used efficiently. And they generally take the long game. So they have the ability, because they're unregulated, to actually work with companies and reposition them if they're falling down. And, Wilbur mentioned this, and I'm a firm believer, if you can't measure it, then you can't correct it. And they're good at measuring. And so, it forces management then to deal with it. Everybody's all up at arms with Doge. And, I had a conversation with San Mizell this morning. And I was the receiver for Finlandia University, and I've sat on 4 other university boards. And the waste and the lack of cost rationalization and organizational structure rationalization, it's you take the budget and you add 4%, and that's the new thing, for next year. And I think private equity forces the rationalization of the business operations, and they're good at identifying core business drivers. And I think that discipline is lost sometimes among ownership, who's dodging a lot of bullets, doesn't have the 30,000-foot view of the playing field to really understand what moves need to be made.
And with that very provocative comment, we'll close it up. And I will say that I personally am very upset about the tariffs on French wine.
Aren't we all, Lorie? We are.
We hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something new from it. If you have any questions or comments for us or any of our guests, please feel free to leave them in the podcast platform of your choice or send us an email at editor@maadvisor.com. We would love to hear from you and get your feedback. And if you haven't done so already, please follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and subscribe to our M&A Alerts newsletter at the links in the description or on our website at www.maadvisor.com. This will help you stay updated on the latest M&A interviews and trends and support our podcast to grow and reach more listeners like you. This is Roger Aguinaldo, the creator and founder of the M&A Advisor. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our M&A Advisor community. Until next time, stay safe and happy dealing.